And just a reminder, if anyone needs, there is a button at the bottom of your screen for closed captioning. Obviously, that's an automated process, and so there will be some mistakes, but if that's helpful for anyone, just letting you know that that's available. So welcome to our lecture this week. We're going to talk, last week we talked about Torah more so, and we're going to focus on prophets and prophetesses and wisdom, and specifically how women are represented and how they sort of show up in this literature. So, wants to be done, which we don't need. Sorry about that. This is the problem of putting a YouTube video in. There we go. There we go. All right, we can pretend the recording just started. So just as a reminder for anyone who was here last week or watched the video, we talked a bit about sort of gender represented in Torah, looking specifically at the creations, not just the one creation narrative. And we talked about what biblical patriarchy looked like, as well as women's agency within Genesis narratives. So for today, as I mentioned, we're looking at more focused, if we're thinking of the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, we're thinking of the Nach part. So we're looking more at the prophets and the writings. And I wanted to focus our attention first, starting actually back to Torah. That's our link. Miriam in the story of Exodus. We're going to see kind of has this legacy of being a prophetess. And so I thought that was a helpful entry point into this conversation about female prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, as well as this idea that's really central, which we talked about a little bit last week in terms of the blessings that the sons inherit within this patriarchal system. But the blessing is often sort of understood as the covenantal relationship between God and his chosen people. And so we're going to take a look at kind of the formulations of covenants, specifically at Sinai, when God offers the 10 Commandments and all of these rules to the people of Israel, who is really included in that. And then we're going to take a look at female depictions of how women are represented and how femininity is depicted in prophetic and as well as wisdom literature. So that, as I said, we're going to start now with the Song of the Sea, as one might call it. So if you're familiar with Exodus 15, there's a passage there that's actually thought to be one of the most ancient, oldest sections that we have of Hebrew Bible, of poetry. And it's often referred to by different names. So Song of the Sea is kind of the standard one, and it's right when the sea is parted and all of the Israelites, the Hebrews, have gone past Egypt and made it into the desert, and they're celebrating. But there are kind of, once again, we find that there are these different descriptions of how things went down. So at the beginning of Exodus 15, there's this little prelude to this hymn, this very ancient hymn that we have. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the God Yahweh. And they said, I shall sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. And so there's this long extended poetic section of verses 1 through 18. And then all we get at the end is a kind of seeming repetition. Then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, picked up a hand drum, or a timbrel, as we say in some translations, and all the women went out after her and danced with hand drums, and Miriam chanted for them. And then what do we have? We actually get a pretty similar set of words here. Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. And just as a note, I'm using the name Yahweh in its historical context. That's not to imply any sort of theological. In Jewish tradition, we would say Adonai, or my Lord. But in looking at this text within its own historical context, I think it's helpful to remember that there are a lot of gods in the ancient world, and this idea of one god and of a monotheistic tradition is not quite developed in the way that we might think it is. What we're looking at here is actually ancient Israelite religion, not what it comes to be established in Jewish tradition. So for Jews, we're more comfortable saying God or Adonai, but in the historical context, these people of Israel would have had no issue using the name. And so, we talked a little bit about last week when you see all caps Lord in your English translations, what that refers to. It's the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God. And so don't be alarmed if and when you see that reflected in my slides. Shoshana, was there a hand or a question?
Yes, actually. Aaron is Moses' sister, so I find it interesting that Miriam, who is also Moses' sister, is referred to as Aaron's sister, not Moses' sister.
Moses' brother, yeah. No, it's
Brother or something.
Sibling, whatever.
Like the three of them are siblings.
Yes. That's a really interesting point you brought up. And I wish I had a bit more time to delve into it because I want to move sort of from Miriam to the prophetic text. But I guess what I'll say in response to that, there are various traditions, textual and probably stemming from oral traditions. Moses may not have always been, everyone's brother in the same way. The name of Moses actually in the Hebrew name Moshe, there's an etymology given of why he's named Moshe, and it's because like through the water he was drawn out, and there's this link to a Hebrew root, which actually doesn't really work in Hebrew, and it's thought that it's probably actually coming from an Egyptian root. And so needless to say, there are some complications around the sort of neat versions of narrative that we are accustomed to. And because there are different strands of text interwoven together, sometimes, there really may be a difference of opinion or perspective, and B, sometimes there's just a lot of overstatement too. So we can't really be sure. Obviously, to the ancient author here, the specification was useful or necessary, but we don't really know. Maybe it could lead us to the idea that, maybe the family is not quite as constructed as we think. It could also just be a point of emphasis, or maybe an attribute of Miriam is that she is known more specifically as the sister of Aaron. Just like how, there are specific attributes that heroes and divine figures will have in ancient myth. But that's a really interesting question. I hadn't necessarily thought of it because if you're familiar with the Messiah, there's also a little recitative right before an aria, and it's like, and Miriam the prophetess, and it's this text. So that's actually what often comes to my mind, that, and also the Debbie Friedman song that I started our class with, which I also love. So all this to say, I think it's really interesting when we look at this text of Exodus 15. On the one hand, we could just refer to it as Song of the Sea, and there is all of this sort of water imagery of vanquishing your foes in the sea with the support of this divine God. But there seems to be, on the one hand, an effort at the start of the chapter to link this hymn with the words of Moses. On the other hand, we see pretty similar language coming about that's from Miriam, but we don't really get any expansion or clarification in the text as to whose words these are. But it is notable that even with that limited bit, we still have this identification of Miriam as a female prophet, as a prophetess. And so we're going to come back to that idea of kind of Miriam's role and whose song maybe we can think of this as. So I just had a little joke here for anyone who remembers the psychic Miss Cleo. Um, Shout out to the 90s. Um, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what is a prophet. Obviously, prophetess, we talked last week about how Hebrew is a gendered language. So when we say prophetess, it really is kind of meaningless, except it's telling us that there's a woman who is involved. But the functionality is the same. And a prophet is generally an intermediary between a god or particular gods and a people. And so prophecy is really serving to provide access to the words of the divine. And so a prophet serves as a mouthpiece or a kind of spokesperson or even messenger of God. And prophecy is not unique to ancient Israel. It's known across the ancient Near East alongside other stuff, which certain biblical texts will say is totally forbidden, like divination, but which we also see hints and glimmers of, both in narrative texts and also in laws banning things. The question being, why would you ban something if no one was already doing it? Prophecy and the words of a prophet we find are often relayed and recorded using very formulaic language. So there's no quotation marks in biblical Hebrew. And so one of the ways in which you know that a prophet is speaking and that this is intended to be heard and read as the words of God is through these formulae, like thus says the Lord. And that just sort of indicates to us that God is understood to be speaking through this intermediary. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, that we're probably familiar with. But I did just want to highlight as well. So Miriam is identified in 5:20 to 21 of Exodus as a prophet. And we also have references to the figure of Deborah in the book of Judges, Huldah in 2 Kings, as well as Chronicles, and Noadiah in Nehemiah. So there are these references to female prophets that we get in other texts. And something else to know about prophets is, on the one hand, depending on the time period in which they're living and in which they are prophesying, their level of power and influence may be very different. So in early pre-monarchic narrative, prophets go hand in hand with these kind of pre-monarch judge figures who speak to God and also serve as like a military leader for the emergent Israelite community. And so they have a lot of power, and we see with Samuel, who is one of the kind of prototypes of what a biblical prophet should look like. Samuel is the one who anoints Saul as the first king of Israel, and then later anoints David as the king of Israel. And so there is a lot of political power that goes hand in hand with this religious capacity. But what we find later on in biblical narrative and in biblical prophetic texts is that oftentimes it does not help your case to be speaking truth to power. And a lot of these figures do not really get the respect that they maybe would expect in their own times. It's only after the fact, when the doom and gloom of their prophecies have actually come to fruition, that people think, oh, maybe this guy actually had something worth listening to. And so to come back to the Song of Miriam, which is my preferred way of referencing it from the book of Exodus, it's interesting that on the one hand, I talked, I guess, about how there is really some sort of attempt to identify this poetry and this hymn with the figure of Moses. On the other hand, it seems to just be associated with Miriam. And what we find and what scholars have discovered in cross-referencing texts that fall outside of the biblical canon is that, Miriam has this close association with this text. And actually there's a text 4Q, which just means from the fourth cave at Qumran, number 365C. So there's a whole complex numerical system for how you identify fragments and scrolls from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but this just means a particular fragment that was found at Qumran. We get this bit of reworked Pentateuch or Torah, and we actually have a kind of textual parallel that follows Exodus 15 with about 7 lines of text that were unknown before. And so they're similar in shared vocabulary, and it seems to be in reference to Miriam. There is this clear link of a shared literary tradition, whether or not it's a copy of the text that we actually have or just a different scribe's take on it. But I have an image on the right side of the screen with an olive branch for the pridefulness. So these are all fragments that were discovered on this piece of papyrus that was found at Qumran. But what it does tell us is that Miriam, there clearly was a broader tradition that we see sort of hints of in the biblical text, but that there is a whole library of literature where Miriam seems to be more closely affiliated both with prophecy in general and as well with this particular hymn. And what's really interesting here is that becomes even more apparent when we compare this Song of Miriam or Song of the Sea to other sort of victory style hymns that we get in the Hebrew Bible. And so Judges 5, for example, has a similar framework for a victory hymn after a military victory with the judge Deborah proclaiming and singing. And so all this to say, we have, even though there seems to be a kind of diminishing on some level of women's influence in some of these stories, we also see the ways in which women's clear links to these stories and clear associations, their clear prominence, and their just well-known stature comes into play. Like, you can't tell the story of the Exodus and of crossing the Red Sea without a nod to this hymn, which most people will think of in relation to Miriam. And so I just, something that I really kind of wanted to hone in on, and that we're going to see this tension back and forth. On the one hand, there seems to be a kind of exclusion that often occurs within these texts that are written by and largely for men. At the same time, there is seemingly some acknowledgement of the roles women do play. And so even in texts that are perhaps coming from a male-centered or androcentric perspective, there are these references that we find that hint at much more significant roles that women did play. And I think it comes back to this idea that we discussed a little bit last week of how to understand biblical texts and read them in context as either a prescription for all time that women should or should not, be fulfilling these kinds of roles, or as a description of a time where perhaps not that many women did. And so when we think of a religious text as scripture, there is often this push to understand truth, capital T, truth, and to see, it's written in this book, it must be this way forever. And where it becomes really interesting and where we can find more nuance is when we can kind of look at the theological aspects or ideas that are animating those texts, while also recognizing the human authorship and the points of view that can be very particular that come along with that. So I just kind of indicated women are wives and mothers. They're also prophets, judges, military leaders within this Israelite literature that we have preserved in the Hebrew Bible, as well as, Dead Sea Scrolls, which we're going to talk a bit about next week. Are there any questions so far? Is everything hunky-dory? No? Yeah. So just again, we're going to keep coming back to this push and pull. Like, there are women, but also how much power and influence do they have? How much are they really included? But also, how do we understand and acknowledge and recognize the contributions that women do make within these narratives and also within the society? So I just wanted to come back on that note to this idea. Oh, there was a question from Aaron.
Yeah, you hear me?
Yeah.
Got it? Got any examples of where God recognizes the importance of women or the power of women?
I mean, I think that specifically, just to go offhand, some of the instances I'm thinking of, we talked about last week, where, technically the man has the right to determine lineage. Technically, there is a process to who receives what blessings. But when a woman takes ownership and takes charge of some of these instances, God also goes along with it. There is, I'm thinking, I just want to make sure I understand your question, because I think there is a bit of a distinction I'm maybe drawing as well, between sort of how the text is portraying or representing something and how God within that representation is maybe reacting or, facilitating or guiding. So I think that there's a difference depending on which way I take your question. Does that make sense?
The way my question was, is there any place in the Bible where, in the Torah, where God is specifically recognizes the rights and power of women?
We're going to come back to that, I think. So yes, but no, but these texts are written by male authors largely at a time where that probably our understanding of gender equality would have been somewhat foreign. So I think that we can find instances where women's knowledge and authority is recognized. One instance would be the woman of valor in Proverbs, I think. But again, the criteria there are often on the basis of being a good wife. And so there is this push and pull once again, of exemplary women who are recognized by God. They are often recognized for stereotypically gendered roles. Although what we talked about last week was also when women step outside of those roles, sometimes that also seems to be fine, especially when there is a kind of deception that works out for the heroes. Does that help address the question a little bit? I can think of some other examples afterwards. I just kind of want to return to what we have. Okay, thanks. So there's a chat message that I missed too. Lynn, the inheritance of those 5 daughters who did not have brothers. Did you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so Aaron asked if there were any times when women were recognized to have their own power. I think that's how I remember his question. And I just kind of threw it in there that there was one occasion when Moses was directing the Israelites about how land was going to be inherited amongst the tribes and the clans, and 5 sisters came up and they said, well, what about us? We don't have any brothers. And Moses had a little chat with God, and God said, yeah, give them what they would have gotten if they were male.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you. The other one that was swimming in my head that I thought of is in the book of Genesis again, when Sarah is able to actually have her own child. There is this question because Abraham has already had a child with Hagar, the sort of handmaiden, if we want to put it delicately. And God says specifically to Abraham, let your wife make the decisions here. She knows best. And what she ends up doing with that power can perhaps be viewed as somewhat cruel. But in that case, there is this clear vote of confidence that God gives that overpowers Abraham's own knowledge or right to making those decisions. So that would be one instance, I think, where once again there is, and this comes back to that idea that I spoke about, heterarchy versus patriarchy. And so this idea that there are these various dimensions of any given society. And on the one hand, ancient Israel does seem to operate in terms of lineage, in terms of land and property, from a very male-centered orientation. But this is to call the entire society male organized, male operated, is also to kind of ignore some of the key places and domains where women do exert and own their own power. So oftentimes those are more related to the home, but there is also an expectation that the woman often will manage all of these dimensions of the home. So hopefully that helps shed some light on that question. So thank you, Aaron. Where I wanted to take us next. Oh, yeah, Lynn.
Yeah, so thank you for talking about women having all this power in the home. And it's true, even in the Bible and the Talmud and all, in our modern day, women might have more power in the home, whereas men might have more power in the outside world. And it's, more or less in different cultures. But I think the definition of a patriarchy is when the men get to decide which domains the women have the power in, and the men can have power in any domain they want.
Yeah, that is also a very good point. So thank you. Where I was trying to differentiate there is more so it's there's a scholar, Carol Myers, who talks about how sometimes overemphasizing the patriarchal aspects of Israelite society can limit our understanding for those specific domains where women exerted authority. But I think it's really important as well to call attention to the power imbalance that a society like ancient Israel has, and that is reflected in their literature. So I think yes, and unfortunately, there is we're making the most of a situation that is inherently predisposed more towards men. So thank you for that clarification as well. And one place where I think we see this even more amplified is in this idea of covenant. So we talked last week about covenant a little bit. It's understood as a formal agreement or treaty between two parties, usually with some kind of terms and conditions that each party needs to fulfill. And so covenants, as we find them in the Bible, actually aren't that different, except for one thing from other ancient sort of treaties that we find in the Near East. So they're very similar in structure to the suzerain vassal treaty. So with this suzerain and a vassal is when a land has been conquered and there is kind of a higher powered state or state actor who has domain and authority over the lower vassal. So the suzerain has a set of responsibilities that they need to fulfill, but it is within an imbalanced sort of dynamic of power where the vassal is subject to the suzerain. That doesn't mean that the suzerain has no obligations, though. They usually need to kind of protect and maintain the rights of the vassal within this imbalanced system. And so a covenant, as we find it in the Hebrew Bible, actually bears a lot of similarities to these suzerain vassal treaties that we see in Assyria, in Babylon, around the same time frame. The difference here is that this covenant that we get reformulated several times over within the Hebrew Bible, is not between two nations or two peoples. It's between a people and a God. And so that's something that's a little different. And yet we find, there are these kind of common elements. So I like to think of the Genesis covenants in terms of the 4 P's. So there is protection, there is prosperity, there is progeny, and there is property. And so I kind of just highlighted where we find these promises in Genesis, in one of the first formulations of covenant. So fear not, I am a shield to you. I highlighted that in yellow because that is protective. Your reward shall be very great, so you will be prosperous. And this is when Abram says, I have no children. What can I do with all of this prosperity that you're promising me? It's just going to go to like my servant, my steward will be my heir. And God says, look towards heaven and count the stars. If you are able to count them, so shall your offspring be. So we get this promise of future progeny. And again, property, the giving of the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. And so while terms of covenant kind of change over time, the idea of covenant as kind of marking Israel apart from its other neighbors and this special relationship with the divine being of Yahweh is a central motivating factor and a theological underpinning for most of the texts that we get in the Hebrew Bible. And so what's really interesting on this sort of coming back to Miriam, coming back to the Exodus story, the Exodus is really important because it's on Mount Sinai where Moses receives the 10 Commandments and he gets this covenant agreement from God that is not just for a family, for Abraham and his descendants, but is actually for an entire people. And yet, in this collective giving of the law and giving of this covenantal relationship with its associated terms and conditions on both ends, there seems to be an inherent exclusion that is baked into it. So Moses came down from the mountain to the people and warned them to stay pure. And he said, be ready for the 3rd day. Do not go near a woman. This is in Exodus 19. And this is in reference to a priestly or Levitical law. If a man has carnal relations with a woman, they shall bathe in water and remain unclean until evening. And so there's a whole fun system of biblical purity that we don't have time to necessarily get into today. But needless to say, it seems a little distressing that this collective formulation of covenant that's being given at Sinai, you got to get rid of the women first. So don't go near a woman. Is there kind of this idea that women are not actually part of the covenant? And this is what a lot of feminist interpreters have really picked up on and have, responded to. And so I think really notably in the book Standing Again at Sinai, Judith Plaskow, she comments on this, saying the Torah is not just history, but also living memory. The Torah reading calls to mind and recreates the past for succeeding generations. When the story of Sinai is recited, women each time hear ourselves thrust aside anew, eavesdropping on a conversation among men and between men and God. And actually, Plaskow quotes Rachel Adler here. Because the text has included her, she is excluded again in this yearly reenactment and will be excluded over and over, year by year, every time she rises to hear the covenant read. And this is really significant because when we think about the reading of the Exodus story, it happens every year, spoiler alert, at Passover. And there is this instruction that is given in the Passover Haggadah that we must retell this story as though we are the ones who have escaped Egypt, and that there is this identification of the Jewish people with the slaves in Egypt. And so what does that mean? What kinds of issues arise if this collective identity that the holiday and this core piece of our sort of foundational story of how we come to be as a people excludes women. And so Glasgow continues, if the covenant is a covenant with all generations, then its appropriation also involves the continual reappropriation of women's marginality. So I think that speaks to, Lynn, what you were kind of mentioning as well, in terms of this, and it comes back as well to this idea that I really want to keep emphasizing, this push and pull. You know, there is this insistence on all the people of Israel, but also don't go near a woman. There is, on the one hand, you know, what could be the Song of Miriam, but maybe Moses actually is the one who sings it. And so we find this core tension. And it's really tempting, unfortunately, to write off this whole exchange as just, you know, completely foregoing women. But because it's because the Bible is a composite piece of literature with various textual traditions interwoven, what's really interesting here is that we actually get a second retelling of the giving of the covenant. This time, the mountain is named as Horeb, but we find a different manuscript tradition here that presents a varying perspective of covenant. And so once again, there's this central tension with the Jewish tradition, because according to the Deuteronomic account of covenant, so Deuteronomic is just, you know, there is a textual there's a textual tradition that seems to stem from the writer or writers of the book of Deuteronomy. And so Deuteronomy comes to be a central sort of framework in how a lot of subsequent tradition will understand the relationship with God and covenant. So within this account of covenant, there seems to be a different perspective, and particularly a different place for women. So Lynn, I saw you raised your hand.
Yeah, I love that you took this passage. The second place where it's highlighted in bright blue coloring.
Yeah.
I read that as part of my speech that I gave on Yom Kippur to the community. And I think that's an incredibly powerful speech. And there's a lot of us are scientists, and there's a phenomenon we see in scientists where if a system gets just too far from a stable state, it's going to eventually go back to equilibrium. It's just something that happens naturally. So by a system of people, a society that just systematically excludes women, it can't survive. So it's going to naturally go back to where women are included, as it does in this passage by retelling it. And in fact, you know, all of our textual tradition is replete with midrash, and there's tons of midrash out there that includes women, maybe even more than includes men. So yeah, these texts do seem to exclude women, but you know, the Jewish people rolled on and included women, and the hell with what those texts do.
Right.
Like,
Yeah,
not the hell with it, but they exclude women, but we're going to include women because it's not natural to do otherwise.
Right. No, I thank you so much. So that's something I definitely want to come back to next week when we're going to take a look at kind of the post-biblical literature, and I want to take a look at Midrash and the commentary tradition, because there are so many sort of gaps that we find in the biblical canon where you see something stated one way and then you see the complete opposite in the next chapter or even the next verse. And so there is a whole tradition of sort of grappling with the meaning or even meanings of text. And you find, as you identified, you find this deep discomfort in a lot of the rabbinic perspectives of this exclusion. And there are ways of trying to kind of recognize and reckon with the ways in which, if all the words of Torah and of the Bible are true and the word of God, how then are we to understand these pieces that maybe don't make sense to us, or that maybe contradict other parts of Torah or our own reason and our own lived experiences? So I just, before I move on, I want to see there was another hand. Ellis?
Yeah, this reminds me of the last session when we looked at the Genesis story of creation, and there were two versions. The high level version treated men and women pretty equally, and it was the detailed version that that did not. And here we see a kind of a more high level version of the covenant, treating men and women pretty equally. While
Mhm.
while the other version was a much more detailed, description of the covenant, and it did not treat men and women as equally. But
Yeah,
uh, sometimes there are different authors who have different points of view on the same story.
yeah. No, I think that's a really great point, and something I want to point out actually. If we go back a slide, um, two slides actually. The reformulation here, where my mouse is hovering, and the do not go near a woman, this is clearly in reference to a priestly law about the purity system. So what this tells us, and what we kind of know about this literary source, is that this is someone who is concerned about the maintenance of priestly law. This is probably a priestly perspective. Whereas Deuteronomy is the biblical text that has at its core this idea that all men are equal in the eyes of God. And so there are different sort of ideologies. Am I lagging or freezing? They seem to be slowing down on my computer. Okay. So there are these different ideologies and points of view that animate and that color and shape the text that we have received. And so I think that's a really great point that you make, Ellis. And I see also, Aaron, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I have a question. So if we accept the notion that the whole thing wasn't written at the same time, um, is there any correlation between the attitude towards women and when it was written?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have a simple answer, because time period is but one component, and we're also guessing for a lot of the dates. So the ways in which a text can be dated can be based on sort of linguistic features of a text. It can also be based on textual copies and how old those copies might be, but we don't know really whether there was one source text or where those traditions are coming. So it becomes, I would say it's a little challenging to fully kind of answer that simply. But I do think that there is a lot of sort of value in recognizing, attitudes change. People's perspectives, even in the same time period, can be very different. Look at the polarization that we see in modern society. You might think that, a speech or a book from one side of the political spectrum is coming from a totally different era than the other. So I think yes, but we don't necessarily have the tools to kind of neatly do that. There are textual scholars who try. There is a tradition of kind of very close reading of text to try and date and identify each sort of author and its positionality. We're kind of operating at a bigger picture level right now. So but yes. And and Lynn, you said maybe God also said to the women, don't go near a man, but the narrator is up there with Moses and the Midrashis was with the women. And so I think, did you want to expand on that or anything? No, I mean, I think all of what you guys are saying is very valid, in terms of, keeping in mind that these are texts that come to us from human hands that are motivated by experiences and beliefs in divine powers. But if it is important to kind of hold fast to the theological truth of a particular text, just remember as well that, we're not always the best translators as humans, and sometimes we also get it wrong. So that's one way, hopefully, of kind of grasping with the imperfections of our religious canon. So I think it goes without saying, I'm not going to read in full detail here. I think while I've been talking. You've probably all seen the blue and we're familiar with this text. But here there is this very explicit recognition that you stand, all of you, before God, and there is great detail given. Your tribal heads, your elders, your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, the stranger within your camp, all of you are entering into the covenant of the Lord. And then it goes in even further detail, those who are standing here with us this day and those who are not here with us this day. And so, something really lovely and also sometimes frustrating in the task of biblical interpretation is any sort of proof text for a particular point of view. Oftentimes there is a negation or a kind of the opposite can also be true in a separate text, or even a few passages down, as we saw a few verses down in Genesis. So Aaron, what was your next question?
Yeah, I had a question. About 3 minutes ago, you threw out the term theological truth.
Mhm.
And I wanted to know if you wanted to just spend a second explaining what you meant, because
Yeah.
it's not a common term that I've heard.
I was just sort of saying colloquially. I think it can be hard for many people who are coming from a religious background to kind of come to terms with a strong belief in the tradition that a text is arising out of and a deep respect for that, while also critically examining a text in its context. So whether or not the animating force that compelled someone to write a text maybe is grounded in their religious experience and in a kind of capital T truth. Part of what I'm really interested in, and hopefully you are too, is examining how those kinds of theological perspectives are depicted in texts that very clearly do have human authors and are, subject to human error and human interpretation. So that was kind of the point I was making. Yeah, Karen, you had a hand as well.
So it seems to me the women would have to be involved with this covenant because, as it turns out, the women were the ones who taught the children about the covenant within the tents, etc., when the men were out doing their worldly business.
Oh, thank you. I love that you just brought that up, because what I want to also bring us to soon is this discussion of kind of women's place in teaching and wisdom. So, yes. Sorry, did you have more to add?
No,
Karen?
that's about it. I mean, it stands to reason that they would have to be part of the covenant.
Of course. Yeah. No, and I agree. I think that as we're all sort of seeing, and as is expressed in a lot of midrash and a lot of rabbinic interpretation, like, women are part of the community, and sort of this insistence based on a following of an archaic purity law system, which the priests may have really felt was extremely important, but the general people may or may not have been following to the exact letter. There is room for different opinions, and there is also an inherent sort of discomfort, I think, for most Jews of not. But it is important that there is, again, this sort of push and pull. So on the one hand, this core foundational part of narrative text that we hold as so central to Jewish identity, the giving of the law at Sinai. There is a version where women's role and their inclusion is an open question. And so again, it's kind of navigating how and where, and to see and look for where women actually sort of fell into place. So something that I wanted to kind of address as we move on to more prophetic and wisdom literature is this idea of divine justice. So the fancy word for that is theodicy. So theos is Latin for God, dike is judgment or righteousness, justice. And so there is this kind of animating principle that starts in the book of Deuteronomy and carries on through what scholars will often refer to as some of the prophetic texts as a Deuteronomic history. And so the narratives of the early kings of like Saul and David fall in how they are sort of framed, how the history is told is within a Deuteronomistic framework. And so there is an inherent link between the, the Torah text of Deuteronomy and the history that comes after it. And so there is this kind of idea of following the terms of the covenant, which we saw again, even back as far as Exodus, you know, that there was a series of things you need to do. And then God will protect you. God will provide those 4 Ps that we talked about. But here we get more sort of detailed, spelled out what it is that the people must do. Arif, did you have a hand?
Yeah, yes, could you, I wondered if you could remind us which books are considered part of the Deuteronomic history?
Yeah, the Deuteronomic history includes a bunch of the prophetic writings. So we'll see Samuel, the 1st and 2nd Samuel mostly, 1st and 2nd Kings. So those are the primary texts. But there is there is kind of exceptions and various things. I can get some more information on exactly which components, but largely the books of Samuel and Kings comprise the Deuteronomic history. And so in Deuteronomy, we get this idea of covenant in terms of this idea of only worshiping God. So know therefore that only the Lord your God is God, the steadfast God who keeps his covenant faithfully to the 1,000th generation of those who love him and keep his commandments, but who instantly requites with destruction those who reject him. Can everyone just mute their selves if they're not speaking right now? Thank you. So therefore, there is a set of things you need to do: follow just God, keep his commandments, and observe faithfully the instruction. And the word instruction in Hebrew is actually Torah. And so the whole 5 books of Torah can be understood as the instruction of God, with which I charge you today. And then following this setting of the terms, we have blessings and curses. So if you follow all of the terms of this covenantal agreement, here are all of the great things that will happen for you or that you will receive in abundance. And there is a very, very long list of curses that ensue if the people of Israel are not able to keep their side of the bargain, in which case God will also not be as generous to them. And so it's important to kind of see this as we go into prophetic literature, that Deuteronomy's model of divine justice on the base of this kind of adherence to the terms of covenant, which include worshiping only God, only the Lord God, Yahweh, as God, and following all of the commandments of the instructions of his Torah. This becomes the dominant framework for how history is going to be understood. So in the Deuteronomic history, in these narrative texts that are purportedly, you know, a telling of events, there is always this framework of, well, this king was successful, or this king was not successful, or this regime was successful, because the people either were or were not following the terms of the covenant. And so divine justice comes to be understood in terms of this adherence to the covenant. And what this actually does is it provides a kind of rationale when things do not work out well for the people of Israel. In other ancient societies where there is not a covenantal relationship with a god, oftentimes what happens is that if a foreign power overtakes your land, the thought process would be, well, their God must have been more powerful. I'm going to worship their God. And what you get through this covenantal idea of justice, or this idea of theodicy, is this notion of justice, that God sort of giveth and God taketh away, and that when bad things happen, it is because the people have not actually followed the terms of the covenant. So we're going to see that play out in both kind of the ways in which biblical prophecy is expressed, and also in how women specifically are depicted in prophetic writings. It seems like, Shoshana, this covenant is also retroactive. See Sodom. Yeah, so there is definitely a kind of recasting backwards onto history that is occurring, and interpreting earlier instances through this lens of divine justice. And Aaron, I see you also had a hand.
Yep, I have a question. So are women required to follow all these rules in the covenant?
So you got one step ahead of me.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, that's great. And I kind of hint at this. I said, who is subject to the covenant here in the bottom left? So yes and no, but this is a really interesting and complex question. So in later rabbinic tradition, we are going to find that there are certain rules that women are expected to maintain, and other ones which are really only the domain and responsibility of men. But something I wanted to keep highlighting as we move forward into the prophetic texts, and into this idea of divine justice being in light of following the covenant, is like, who is this covenant for? And also, if women are part of these societies that are being punished for not following the covenant, shouldn't they be included in the blessings that could ensue too? So, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. Sorry, it was, I just saw another chat. Shoshana says, as a therapist, this divine justice can be seen as a kind of victim blaming and gaslighting. I think you hit the nail on the head, unfortunately. And what we're going to see, there's a little bit of trigger warning, is that this is used to kind of justify and explain a lot of bad things that befall the people of Israel. And often we're also going to see that it actually plays into really violent and often misogynistic language and terminology and imagery. So I think that's important to also kind of keep in mind. So I wanted to look a little bit at this idea that's going to come in the prophetic text of daughter Zion. And so within prophetic and poetic literature, the use of metaphors is very common, as well as metonymy. So metonymy refers, is like when a one word is, or a name is representative of of a bigger concept. And so you have these kind of stand-ins. So Zion stands in for the people of Judah. And just to keep in mind our sense of geography here, there are two kingdoms of ancient Israel that are united under King David, according to the Deuteronomistic history, but that do not really make it and are separated after King David's reign. And so in the north is Israel, in the south is Judah. And what happens is the northern kingdom of Israel is overtaken by the Assyrians, and Judah hangs on a little bit longer before ultimately being conquered by Babylon. And so what we see in the prophetic writings is this kind of recognition of what has already befallen the people of Israel and what could be coming next for the people of Judah. And all of this comes to be interpreted in light of the covenant. And so the prophetic books all, I said, function intertextually. There's sort of this interaction with earlier compositions, what I think of as a kind of riffing on these Pentateuchal themes from the 5 books of Torah, and especially in Deuteronomy. And so the city of Jerusalem and its inhabitants are often rendered or referred to as the either daughter Zion or daughter of Zion. Sometimes that of is not necessarily present, or it can be hard to translate from the Hebrew, whether it's kind of the possessive or not. And this can be understood within a broader practice in antiquity of personifying cities as women. We also get a daughter Babylon in Isaiah. And so what is important to note here is that Zion is portrayed metaphorically here, not just as a daughter, also as a wife and mother in various texts. And so Jerusalem has these kind of multiple layers of meaning, which I think is actually pretty interesting given the conversations we have right now about Israel, specifically about sort of who gets to claim that land. Israel, as a physical piece of land, has a presence in the world, but there is also a lot of symbolic meaning that is attributed to the land of Jerusalem, that goes far beyond the sort of physical geography of the place. So in the book of Isaiah, the metaphor of daughter Zion is used to emphasize the northern kingdom, Israel, and its apostasy. So its failure to worship only one God, it's worshiping of other gods, or as the Bible calls them, false idols. And so this failure to keep only one God, the God of Israel, as the one being worshipped, is understood and framed as a violation of that covenantal agreement. And how we see this depicted in the book of Isaiah is often through really violent and, as I said, misogynistic language. So Isaiah 121, talking about daughter Zion as a stand-in for the people of Israel. She has become a harlot or a whore, the faithful city that was filled with justice, where righteousness dwelt, but now murderers. And so there is this deep kind of identification of the people of Israel through this feminine image of daughter Zion, and this personified female iteration of an idea of a city. And so that is really, I think, interesting. And what we find in other prophetic texts is sort of strikingly similar at times. And so the book of Jeremiah, who I have a little illustration, an artistic rendering of the weeping prophet Jeremiah, is once again, we see this framing of the political situation of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah through metaphor. And in particular here, it's through a kind of sacred marriage metaphor where the people of Israel and Judah serve as the bride for God. And so this comes back to this idea of covenantal justice and theodicy, that the moral pollution ensuing from worshiping other gods actually represents a stain on the land itself. And it's framed as a kind of adulterous exchange, that going to other gods and other deities and worshiping them is basically a woman stepping out on her husband. And so, on the one hand, this is very powerful imagery. Something to keep in mind here is that prophets, although we are reading their words, obviously in a written medium, prophecy is itself an oral genre. And so the words that we have in these prophetic texts are presumably sort of records or people writing down the words that would have been proclaimed in the public square. And so having really powerful imagery that would kind of be instantly understandable to the predominantly men who wouldn't like the idea of their woman cheating on them. And, all of this, this imagery is so violent and so powerful, but it's for a particular purpose, to highlight how the prophet sees these kind of acts of apostasy as the ultimate betrayal, and it's putting it into terms of a marriage that would have been more understandable to men of that time period, if that makes sense. So I see there's a couple, yes, he did seem to suffer from swollen legs and feet, at least in that depiction. Not good circulation there. Shoshana says, so they're using shocking language to get their point across. And I think exactly there is this kind of poetic rendering and heightened dramatization of what is happening on a kind of theological level that has implications on the political. And the way in which it is being portrayed is through a set of ideas that men would be familiar with. And so there is something visceral and painful about a man who thinks his wife has been cheating, especially within an ancient patriarchal society where the purity and sanctity of a woman is especially, of note and of importance, and where, a woman's bride price in an ancient society is partly dictated on her level of purity going into that marriage, whether or not she can be verified as a virgin. And so these things that in our society, cheating scandals come and they go, in an ancient world, in ancient Israel, these are much more high stakes. So I'm just going through the chat and I see there's also a hand. Lynn says the imagery in Jeremiah and Ezekiel is especially vivid and horrendous. I would tend to agree with that. So we're looking at a few key examples, but if it's too much, if people need to step away, that's also okay. And Aaron says, I'm not sure that it's shocking in a society that allows men to have several wives, but a wife can't have multiple husbands. So that's also a very excellent point. This is a powerful image, but again, we see this kind of imbalance and this frankly not so flattering depiction on the one hand, there's an identification of these men with the wife, with God as the more powerful husband figure, perhaps, the provider, the person who, they both have obligations to one another, but there is this power differential. And it's also kind of presumably would be embarrassing for men to hear themselves described in this way, that they probably would not want their wives described either. And so there is this kind of reckoning and playing with gender stereotypes and men's discomfort here as well. Unfortunately, I think, especially to a modern reader and to modern sensitivities, to the detriment, of also the female readers. So Ellis, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, in the previous slide, you referred to the term daughters of Judah, was it? No, Zion. Okay.
Yeah.
In a way that they're using a feminine term to refer to a city or a geographic area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's similar to the way we use feminine ideas to refer to justice, or liberty, the Statue of Liberty.
Lady Liberty.
Yeah, or justice is often portrayed as a woman. And so it implies, at least in my term thinking, that there are qualities of women that we aspire to and we hold in kind of reverence, and we use that so that we use the idea of a feminine city kind of picks up on that, just the way we think of justice or liberty as a woman.
Yeah.
But that's a different, so that's at a kind of a high level.
Yeah.
In the following slide, you get into a lot of details, which are clearly don't look at the higher qualities of women, but I think that the two kind of are juxtaposed against one another. You've got some very sexist ways of looking at women, and you also, but you're still at a high level have this notion of qualities that are good about women, and why we use them to represent some of our highest aspirations.
Definitely. And I think there is certainly a level of idealization that you see and that you want to see in your daughters, in your wives, as men who might be hearing these prophecies being read. And that's, I think, part of why there is so much power, because nobody wants their daughter or wife to be the harlot that's described in these prophecies. And so there is, a lot of sort of violence and harm that can come from an overly simplistic reading of these texts. There's also, I think, a great deal of power in the visceral components and kind of character of this language. And so, but here, I think what's interesting before we move on is the section I've sort of bolded in blue. She saw, so Israel having, gone awry, gone astray, and Judah watching it all. So here we have these two kingdoms. The kingdom of Israel has already been conquered and already been lost to the Assyrians, and now Judah is left. And what does Judah do? You would think that Judah would, make sure the same thing doesn't happen. But within this metaphor, she saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one, Israel, I had sent her away with a decree of divorce. Yet her false sister Judah did not fear. She too went and played the whore. Because she took her whoredom so lightly, she polluted the land, committing adultery with stone and tree. And some of what I touched on, I think, a little bit, but we didn't have as much time as I would have loved to delve into, is how specifically this idea of pollution is actually a physical manifestation of a violation of a kind of ethical purity. So when we talk, remember the do not go near a woman, that section from Leviticus that informs the Exodus Sinai giving of the covenant. That is kind of a ritual, impermanent form of contagion that can occur when, women are bleeding, or also when a man ejaculates. There are these kinds of impermanent stains that need to be kind of washed away, and you need to wait for time to pass. But the kind of ethical transgressions that we're talking about with adultery and apostasy, those within the kind of understanding of priestly purity in ancient Israel, there is actually a more permanent mark that is left on the land when there is a kind of building up of these moral or ethical stains. I don't want to spend too much time because I know we're running out of time a little bit. But there's another example that I'm going to just point to. I like to think of them as the apostasisters in the book of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel similarly frames Israel and Judah's apostasy metaphorically in terms of adultery, with the Assyrian conquest of Israel serving as a warning for Judah. And so here, it's not the most elevated form of metaphor, because we get a clear spelling out of who exactly. There's these two sisters. Obviously, to the author, it was important to mention their virgin nipples. I don't exactly know why. I guess just, the strength of that visual metaphor. Their names were Aholah and Oholibah. They became mine. Aholah is Samaria, being Israel, and Oholibah is Jerusalem. So once again, we get this kind of these two daughters standing in, and we get this depiction of these communities and these lands, these people, through sort of rebellious daughters who do not follow the rules. And it's interesting too, this bolded part, she became a byword among women. Ezekiel is specifically trying to stick his audience. Did you want to expand on that, Aaron?
Yeah, if you'd like.
To shock his audience.
Yeah, shock his audience. I think I think that's Ezekiel's got a specific motive there.
Yes, absolutely. But what's really interesting is this language of her becoming a byword among women. This actually echoes part of the Deuteronomic curses, that if the people of Israel do not follow and abide by all the terms and conditions of the covenant, Israel will be like a byword among other nations. That, so there is this direct parallel to this idea of covenant with this metaphor of adultery, and of stepping outside of this sacred relationship. And there is this framing of the kind of conquests and history of these people through ultimately it's through this understanding of their relationship to their God. And so just to kind of go to echo and affirm what Erin just said, some feminist readers and scholars of Ezekiel have actually referred to his work and this kind of tradition of really shocking, jarring, violent imagery as a kind of porno prophetic. So Italia Brenner uses that word to kind of explain the visceral nature of this language that is so clearly meant for shock and sort of titillating value, but that also holds a kind of rhetorical power in, getting everyone's attention onto what he's saying. And so there is this kind of power, but there is also, of course, an inherent violence in these kinds of characterizations. And the ways in which violence is kind of promised and described is like exceptionally gratuitous. And so there is a question of kind of the ethics of reading this sort of literature, but at the same time, this is the literature we have, and we need to, and I think it's important to kind of not to skim and ignore the uglier parts of tradition, but to kind of understand where those perspectives are coming from and why we've preserved writings that may disturb us in some places, like that make us uncomfortable. So yeah, Karen. I think you're on mute still.
So to me, this is victimizing making the victim the evildoer.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So this, in a sense, is what women are fighting about today in the Me Too movement, that the one who is oppressed, victimizing the oppressed, basically. So making it sound like they were the ones who caused the abuse.
Yeah.
Or brought it upon themselves to be a victim, to become a victim. And in a sense, that's what people are doing about Israel. They brought it upon themselves, making them victim when the Palestinians came in and raped the women and destroyed their homes and killed people. So it just reminds me of, these are men writing this.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to read, people need to read this with that understanding.
Definitely. I think that's a really apt kind of comparison and point you're drawing there. And I think, it's important to also go back. Shoshana earlier mentioned this idea of kind of gaslighting of, the harm that you're receiving and experiencing right now, it's actually coming from your misdeeds and your failures. And there is this kind of guilt and this sort of fatalistic thinking that is inherent in some of this theology. And that's something to come to terms with. The other flip side of that, not to make it better, but to understand that whereas other societies and other traditions kind of die out when their God is not sort of as powerful as if you're being conquered, it's a very interesting perspective to think, it's not that the gods I was worshiping in my community and my faith we're not strong enough. It's actually my God is so powerful, he's using these other beings and these other peoples. So there is this kind of really interesting way in which this theological perspective really informs how history is understood, and also how the Jewish people come to remain and exist today. So as negative and harmful as that can be, there is also a kind of reckoning with the idea that some of this thought process and this victim blaming also helps account for when God's justice does not necessarily seem to accord with what we've been promised or what we've been expecting. And so there is this kind of built-in defense for when bad things happen to presumably good people. Well, it's because you didn't follow the terms of the covenant. And so, you know, that's an oversimplification for sure. But I think
But it's also blame takes people to who read this, and in those days who read their teachings, that the Jewish people could be blamed easily, of blaming women for their misfortunes.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And it's funny that you brought up kind of a more contemporary example, because also the other flip side of that too is where my mind went from the very first story in Genesis, when God says, you know, who told you to eat this apple, and who told you you were naked? And Adam's immediate response is, well, the woman you gave me.
Yep.
So I think this tendency is age old, and I think it's then also reflected in these texts that come to inform so much of the ensuing traditions that follow them. Shoshana, did you want to add something? I saw that do you want me to read your comment, or did you want to speak on it? You want me to read? Okay. So the arrogance of our ancestors to agree to a covenant for all of their descendants, and to affirm the covenant on the 8th day of life before the child in question can make an informed consent about joining the covenant. That's also another really interesting to mention there, which, you know, ancient authors weren't really concerned with, but we might be.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, you know, all of these boys are given circumcisions before they can consent to it. And over the years, that has been a symbol that has gotten Jewish men killed, you know? And I don't know, I have complicated feelings about that.
Yeah, and hopefully we can come back to some of those when we talk. That's one of the many issues I would love to hopefully delve into a little bit when we get to more modern issues in Jewish practice and sort of gender dynamics. So we are running out of time. I just kind of wanted to end with some questions and just another kind of parallel, another push and pull, so to speak, and another choice that we maybe have as interpreters when we are coming across this literature. So we've looked now at some of the texts from the Nevi'im, from the prophets, and the other part of the Tanakh is the Ketuvim, or the writings. And so I just wanted to kind of touch on this notion of wisdom. And so there is this link, I think, that you can identify within the wisdom texts and traditions in the Hebrew Bible to this Deuteronomic idea of covenant. And so what is wisdom? How is it defined? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So fear of God is also one of the sort of terms that is used for maintaining exclusive worship of God in those Deuteronomic promises. And so there is kind of this link to Deuteronomistic thought here, and this idea of kind of this covenant for whomever it may be. And the Hebrew Bible presents wisdom as a kind of religious disposition, often in light of parental instruction. And something that's kind of troubling is the extent, especially in the book of Proverbs, for example, which is one of the key wisdom texts that we have in the Hebrew Bible, it's really a father to his son. And so again, you know, where are the women in this? What's interesting is we have, my son, heed the discipline of your father and do not forsake the instruction of your mother. And so on the one hand, the actual instruction seems to be directed towards a son, but there is also an acknowledgement of the instruction, Torah, of your mother. And so I think that's really interesting and kind of brings us back to this. Was it Lynn who brought up kind of the ways in which women are actually the ones educating children on tradition? So even if they are, whether or not we view them as part of the covenant in terms of how the text frames it, the women are oftentimes the ones tasked with actually having the knowledge to pass on to the next generations.
I don't think that was me. Might have been
Sorry.
someone else.
Okay, well, I gave it to you, but sorry
All
about
right.
that.
Well, we're all commenting on all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is
Oh,
such
it was Karen.
complex.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's such complex material, you know, the biblical view of women. And it, you know, a lot of the aspects of it resonate down to our present time. And we could get off on all kinds of side conversations, but I'm going to try to stick with the Jewish view because that's what we're
Yeah.
here for.
Totally. So I'm just going to kind of emphasize that there are, yeah, then if you can, and Aaron, I think you're not muted. There are links as well. So Israelite wisdom, as we find it in the Hebrew Bible, is obviously informed by these Deuteronomic and Israelite components. Oh, is that Ariv? If you can mute
Yeah.
yourself. Thank you. But there are also sort of parallels that we find to other textual traditions. Now, I see that we're at time. I was going to just highlight quickly a set of 2 quick passages, but if anyone needs to go, that's totally fine. So thank you for being here. I'm happy to go a couple minutes more and just skim these concepts that I wanted to get to. But I'm not offended if anyone has to leave.
Canaanite poetry means not Hebrew. Canaanite.
Yes. So Canaanite, even though we talk about sort of Israel, ancient Israel as the land of Canaan, the Hebrew Bible also makes mention of different people who may or may have been in the land prior to that. And there is a lot of sort of division and separation of the people of Israel in a lot of these foundational texts. Whether or not these were separate or discrete populations, or whether or not there really was a bit more sort of blurred lines, that is a question that sort of scholars ask. But I just wanted to kind of call our attention before we go to these 2 images. One, we talked about daughter Zion as, on the one hand, this ideal, and on the other hand, this almost disgrace. And the wife as, again, this ideal of a kind of femininity, a kind of relationship and fidelity. And again, we sort of see here the positive aspects here of wisdom personified in female form. And so the Hebrew that's used here is chokhmah, but that gets translated in the New Testament and in the Greek as Sophia, as wisdom. And there is this very interesting poetic aside in the chapter 8 of Proverbs of the kind of creation of wisdom. So the Lord created me at the beginning of his course as the first in his works of old. I was fashioned in the distant past. And this comes back to that narrative of creation that we talked about. So there was still no deep when I was brought forth, no springs rich in water. And when he, put together all of these parts of the world, when he fixed the foundations of the earth, I was with him as a confidant. And now, once again, this is directed to sons. Listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways, keep discipline and become wise. Happy is the man who listens to me, coming early to my gates each day. For he who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord, but he who misses me destroys himself. All who hate me love death. And so it's interesting. There is, on the one hand, this obvious kind of positive association here between women and wisdom. On the other hand, we have this wisdom that is being guided and directed towards men's acquisition of knowledge and wisdom, my sons. So they are the recipients of this wisdom tradition. And I think that's really kind of interesting to note. Something I wanted to also call attention to, which we don't have time to get into, is that, you know, ancient Israel is not alone in these depictions of kind of feminine wisdom. And so there are links in the characterization in Proverbs 8 to the Egyptian goddess of truth, justice, harmony, and balance, Ma'at. And she's depicted in anthropomorphic terms, born of the sun god Ra at the beginning of creation. So very sort of similar parallels. So all this to say is there is a great deal of kind of cultural borrowing or syncretism, and that these ideas that on the one hand are specific to a particular ideology, perhaps to a particular, are made to fit within a particular theological framework, also is informed by the broader society and world in which it arises. There's also these links to Isis, who has other names and tradition. And so there seem to be these parallels. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all of her paths peaceful. So if anyone's familiar, like the Hebrew is equivalent of that. The Hebrew here is like Darchei Noam, and Darchei Shalom, and I mean, these are often synagogue names, but there is this kind of link that we see of cultural borrowing and stuff that's important to note. And the last thing I just kind of wanted to end, so on the one hand, we have this very positive association, and of course, biblical poetry is rife with parallelism. So there's always the good and the bad, the wicked and the righteous, the learned and the dumb. And so wicked versus poor. And so there is, of course, a parallel foil to wisdom who's personified as a loose woman. So if Lady Wisdom was meant to be the sort of pinnacle, the goal to which you are striving, that ideal type, Lady Folly, as she comes to be described in the English translation, is the opposite. And we kind of see a similar sort of thought framework, I think, that we saw within the prophetic writing. So all this to say, you know, the representations we get of women, pretty complex. There's no one way in which we can kind of characterize them, even just within a certain biblical text or within a certain biblical tradition. But I think when we can look at these texts through a lens of covenant, through a lens of who is included and who are these promises for, and who do they have an impact on, we can kind of grapple with both the positive and the negative depictions and sort of get a better sense of where these ancient authors and voices are coming from. So that's where I'd like to leave it. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer, but thank you all, and thanks for your patience as I know we were a few minutes over.
Thanks very much, Simon.
All right, have a good night.